The war in Ukraine is entering a moment no one expected this soon. A potential ceasefire is suddenly on the table, and yet Europe says it was kicked out of the room. Washington is pushing for a diplomatic breakthrough, Moscow believes the battlefield is turning in its favor, and Kiev is running out of time, ammunition, and political space. If a ceasefire is brokered now, someone will pay the strategic price. The question isn't if that happens, it's who. Stay with me. We are at a crossroads because everything is shifting at once. The battlefield, the politics, and the alliances. On the front line, Ukraine's ability to launch major offensives is almost gone. Ammunition is running low, and Western military aid is less predictable than ever. Russia, meanwhile, has been learning, adapting, and mobilizing steadily across the east. No dramatic breakthroughs, but the gains are enough to shift the psychological and political balance. In Washington, political pressure is building. Budget fights, election cycles, and strategic competition with China all push toward one outcome: a controlled endgame in Ukraine, on America's terms. When the U.S. moves first on peace talks, the center of gravity automatically shifts away from Europe. European leaders woke up to find Washington already drafting proposals and testing ideas with Kiev and other partners. Ukraine is under pressure, Russia sees opportunity, and the United States wants to control the next phase. But if the U.S. takes the lead, how far does Europe fall behind? And what does being kicked off the negotiating table really mean for the continent's future? For Europe, the realization came late and hard. When news broke that Washington had circulated early ceasefire concepts, European capitals weren't just surprised, they were alarmed. For the first time since the war began, the future of Europe's security architecture was being drafted without Europe in the room. Europe assumed it would always be a central actor. The war is on Europe's doorstep. Europe pays most of the humanitarian bill and will pay for most of the reconstruction. It is the region directly threatened by a resurgent Russia. But diplomacy works on power, not logic. And today, the power is in Washington. The U.S. supplies the bulk of Ukraine's long-range firepower, coordinates military intelligence, and leads NATO's strategic posture. Germany and France suddenly look smaller than they thought. Berlin is still rebuilding its military after decades of underinvestment, and its economic influence is strong, but strategic influence remains shaky. Paris, which has long promoted the idea of European strategic autonomy, faces the harsh reality that real autonomy doesn't exist when America is making the decisive calls. Inside European institutions, the mood is a mix of frustration and fear. Fear that a deal shaped by Washington might lock in a fragile security order, fear that Europe will be stuck paying for a settlement it didn't design, and fear that Eastern European states will lose trust in Brussels' ability to protect them. If Europe isn't at the table now, it might not be at the table later when the continent's security order is rewritten. At this stage, Ukraine isn't just fighting on the battlefield, it's fighting for political survival. That survival is now shaped by events inside Kyiv as much as by bullets on the front line. A string of high-profile corruption probes has directly implicated figures from Zelensky's inner circle. Most notably, Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff and key diplomatic operator, resigned after investigators searched his home in connection with state energy contracts. Multiple other officials tied to the presidential camp were also caught in the fallout. Complicating the picture, Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies are closely linked to US and EU partners. While this strengthens accountability, it also gives external actors leverage over high-level investigations. Some analysts suggest the timing of these probes could be used to pressure Kyiv toward concessions in peace talks. Intentional or not, the effect is the same. Zelensky's bargaining power is weakened. Facing domestic scandal, dwindling public trust, and external pressure, Zelensky confronts one of the hardest choices of his career: accept a deal many Ukrainians see as unacceptable, or resist American pressure and risk losing the military support that keeps Ukraine alive. Neither option is safe. Accepting a deal could expose him to accusations of betrayal. Resisting could threaten Ukraine's survival. Ukraine is politically and militarily cornered, and that is exactly what Moscow hopes to exploit. From Moscow's perspective, the war is finally tilting in its favor. Russia's goals remain unchanged: prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and maintain dominance on its western border. Moscow isn't chasing dramatic city conquests anymore. It is aiming for a frozen conflict that reflects battlefield realities, locks Ukraine out of Western alliances, and consolidates territory under de facto Russian control. After early setbacks in 2022, Russia shifted to attrition warfare, a strategy it can sustain. Its defense industry is expanding, artillery production is stable, and the population can be mobilized without triggering collapse. Meanwhile, Western support has slowed, become more conditional, and is politically constrained. Every delay in aid, every political dispute in Europe, and every internal scandal in Kyiv reinforces Russia's belief that time is on its side. Putin doesn't need a dramatic breakthrough. He needs Ukraine's political stability to crack before Russia's does. Moscow believes that moment may be near. If the war is moving toward a political crossroads, the actor with power to swing the balance is the United States. Washington has been the backbone of Ukraine's war effort, financially, militarily, diplomatically. A shift in the U.S. position doesn't just influence the battlefield, it redefines it. In Washington, the conversation isn't about victory anymore. It's about sustainability, cost, and strategic priorities. Policymakers are thinking less about how to help Ukraine win and more about how to prevent it from losing without draining resources or political capital. Every delayed aid package, every internal debate in Congress, and every anti-corruption push in Kyiv sends a clear signal: prepare for the next phase, because unlimited support isn't permanent. A negotiated ceasefire might not be ideal, but it could be acceptable. It would free resources, reduce escalation risk, and allow Washington to frame the outcome as preventing collapse rather than achieving victory. If Zelensky is politically vulnerable, Washington may apply leverage to ensure a deal moves forward. For the U.S., this is strategy, not personal loyalty. If negotiations occur, the real question isn't whether a deal will happen, it's what that deal will look like. From Washington's perspective, a managed freeze is enough. From Moscow's perspective, the same freeze is an opportunity, holding occupied territory, limiting Ukraine's future alliances, and consolidating a political advantage without new battles. Europe, however, could see its influence collapse. A frozen conflict shaped by US and Russian priorities, not European leadership, exposes just how little Europe can dictate its own security. Ukraine stands to lose the most. A freeze likely means territorial concessions, restrictions on alliances, and years of political uncertainty. Any leader who signs such a deal faces domestic backlash. Ukraine wouldn't just be asked to accept the end of offensive ambitions, it would be asked to live in a gray zone, not fully protected, not fully sovereign, and not fully able to rebuild. The war is now defined more by political calculations than battlefield advances. Ukraine is militarily stretched, politically fragile, and increasingly dependent on allies whose priorities are shifting. Russia is consolidating, confident that time is on its side. The United States is balancing strategy and domestic politics. Europe is exposed, divided, and unprepared for the world that may emerge. The road ahead isn't defined by certainty, it's defined by choices. How much risk nations are willing to accept, how much territory they're willing to trade, and how much unity they can preserve. Because whether this war ends with a ceasefire, a frozen line, or an uneasy peace, one thing is clear. The next phase won't be decided by who wins the next battle, but by who understands the new reality first.